Hi, everybody. I am Ellen Clair Lamb, Claire to my family and friends. Delighted to be here today to moderate this discussion. I am a writer, editor, and researcher based in Pentagon City, literally 2 blocks from the Pentagon. But with me today are Alma Katsu, the author of 6 traditional novels and a graphic novel. But before she was a writer, she spent 30 years as an intelligence officer with the National Security Agency and the CIA. She writes historical fiction, but in her career, she is focused on emerging technologies, and she still consults as a futurist, specializing in emerging technologies. Red Widow, set in the present day, is her most recent novel, and it's soon to be a TV series on Fox. We also have with us Lara Prescott, whose first novel, The Secrets We Kept, was an instant bestseller, a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, an Edgar Award nominee, and the winner of the McCavity Award for Best Historical Fiction. She was a political campaign consultant before turning to full-time fiction, and studied political science at American University and worked in international development in Namibia and South Africa. And last but not least is Paul Vidich, who is the author of 4 Cold War era espionage novels, most recently The Mercenary, as well as award-winning short stories. Before turning to writing, Paul was a music and media executive with time at Time Warner, AOL, and Warner Music Group, where he was executive vice president in charge of global digital strategy. I am delighted to be with you all here. I absolutely loved all of your most recent books. And this feels like an obvious and too simple a question, but what makes espionage such fertile ground for fiction? Alma, do you want to start?
Well, I have to say, I'm really looking forward to what Paula and Laura have to say, because for me, it was sort of a no-brainer after 10 years of not writing spy fiction. I mean, there's the obvious things where, it's all about secrets, it's baked into what the story is. It's often secrets within secrets, the whole hall of mirror things that just makes such a nice, twisty labyrinth for a writer to really dig into.
Paul, you're the one farthest away from the espionage field in your day job, or
in my day job, right? Well, actually, working in corporate America was good preparation for keeping secrets and understanding corporate shenanigans. So I feel like I had a tutorial in bureaucracy. But I agree with Alma. But in addition, what I would say is that a lot of spy fiction tends to be set in, intriguing places. It tends to have plots that have a lot of suspense associated with it. And the best novels also deal with the moral quandaries of the characters. And so when you put secrets, moral quandaries, and international intrigue together, you can end up with very interesting stories, and I think some powerful stories about the human soul in the best case.
Yeah, I want to say, after Paul's great answers, is why I am interested in spy novels as a genre, is that secrecy and that moral grayness, and exploring all the human spectrum of why someone might work in intelligence, or how their loyalties shift over time, and different emotions and human errors that come out due to the work, whether it's bravery or cowardice or greed. There's so much to explore, and it's really what all great novels explore anyway. It's that human experience. I think with the spy genre, you can just kind of hone in on it right away.
And in The Secrets We Kept, that novel is set in the late 1950s, and it's specifically about women who worked for the CIA in the very earliest days of the CIA for a whole range of different reasons, many of whom kind of wound up in it accidentally. So why do your characters want to be spies? Why do they want to get into that world?
Well, looking at my book in particular, I focused on the CIA's mostly women typing pool of the late 1950s. And when I was doing my research about this untold mission of Dr. Zhivago and using books as weapons in the Cold War, I was reading all of these reports and memos on CIA's website that they had recently released in 2014. And I kept thinking, there's so much redaction, so many details. The players involved have been redacted from history, and I wanted to know who typed those memos and reports, which is like this rabbit hole of research that I went down to learn about these women who came to the agency. Some of them came highly qualified from colleges like Vassar and the top of their class, and this was the only entry point that they had to work at this government agency during that time. Others came via, the traditional typing school route, working their way up the ranks that way. But it was really one of the only entry points available to women. Not the only one, but one of the main entry points. And so I think some of the women came from different, goals of why they wanted to work there. Some just wanted a job, which I explore through one of my characters, Arena, who kind of just happens on this as a good job. And she so happens to go on to do other things. Others were leftovers from World War II and women who worked in intelligence in the OSS. And after the war was over, this was a kind of a gradual way to keep doing that work, and one of the only ways they could keep doing that. And while the men that they worked side by side became their bosses, this is how they could continue their work. So I do think there's different ways that people come into it, especially at that time. And I don't think patriotism was maybe the number one. I think people were looking for work, looking to use their talents, and this was a way that they could. And I think people come from different forms of loyalty and wanting to prove themselves in other ways. So that's something I explore in my book, and it's interesting to hear what other people have to say. But I think as the times changed, that definitely evolved, especially for women.
Yeah, well, Alma, when you went into this field, how did you get into it? You've got two characters in your book, two major female protagonists, both of whom are in this field. Do you identify more with one or the other, and how does their experience reflect your own?
Yeah, it's so funny. I get that question a lot. And I think most people expect me to identify with the main character, Lindsay, who's younger and sort of a rising star who, runs into the problem that people, you run across in all businesses. And that is, if you're perceived as going too far, too fast, there's always going to be people who want to sort of take you down a peg. So she's made a few enemies. And the other main female character is Teresa Warner, who's been there a little longer. They're both in Russia division, so they work the Russian target. But she was sort of the golden girl when she first came in, and she ended up falling in love with one of the two main managers who were also sort of working their way up the ranks. And it was almost like a Camelot story, and she had married the King Arthur figure, so to speak. But there was always this third character, Eric Newman, who was Richard Warner's sort of right-hand man, and there to support him and Teresa as well. But something happens to Richard, and he ends up getting killed in a botched extraction operation in Moscow. And Teresa's shattered, and it's sort of like the reclusive widow at this point in the book. And I have to say, I probably identify a little bit more with Teresa. Not that my husband was killed in an extraction effort, but, Teresa sees what it's like to, when the agency sort of withdraws its support. I was listening to what Laura was saying, because even though I didn't enter service in the late 50s, I did enter in the early 80s. And I have to say, while things had changed, you'd be surprised how little they changed in some respects, where women still, you could come in on the same level as the guys, but you kind of quickly found that the playing fields were not quite even. And you often were sort of still the handmaiden as you watched, your male peers, work their way up the ranks and becoming the managers and that sort of thing. I'm happy to say that's more of a thing of the past, but it's surprising, it's not quite as far away as you may think.
And Paul, at the end of The Mercenary, there's a character who says something along the lines of, all spies are mercenaries. And it goes back to this idea that ultimately everybody does things for one of two reasons, either love or money. But aren't your characters working for love?
Well,
Kinda?
yeah, well, yes. And
Why did they do what they do?
so the origin of my characters really came from two places, two very distinct places. The novel is set in Moscow. I decided I wanted to set a novel in Moscow. And I began reading the biographies and autobiographies of Russians who defected. And for the most part, it was Russians who defected to the West and not, agents from, except for Kim Philby, agents from the West defecting to the East. And so there are a lot of these biographies and autobiographies, so you can get a rich picture of the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s from what they said. And I found it interesting to have, these men and women who would be willing to give up their lives and their families in order to escape the system they were in. So that was one sort of set of inspirations. And the other was the TV show, The Americans, which was written by a good friend of mine. And if you remember that story, there are the two kids. And I always wondered what happened to the son. He found out his parents were the sleeper agents. And what's his choice in life? And so my principal character, Alex Guerin, sort of becomes that kid who, because of his relationships to the CIA, is able to join the CIA. And then once in the CIA, he's actually a double agent working for the KGB, but then discovers he didn't like what he was doing, and he doubles back to the CIA. And that's his entry into Moscow, is with all of that baggage. And in this case, you asked the question of love or money. I don't think it was either love or money. I think he found himself in this place where his world had sort of been set for him by his mother. And in some ways you grow up with your background, and then you struggle with your choices based on what you've been dealt. And love comes into that, as does money. But I think the motivation that drove him was this complex set of entangled emotional responses he had to the world he was living in. And the same is true of the Natalia, the Soviet woman that he does have a relationship with. She is the daughter of a KGB officer who was executed. And so and then she's groomed to be part of the KGB, but she has these very complex emotional reactions to the role she's been given. And then these two sort of mercenaries, or emotional mercenaries, come together, and they can share the feelings about their worlds in a way they can't share them with anybody else, because the secrets they share are things you wouldn't, talk about with people outside of that little small place that you occupy.
I do think that's one of the most interesting things about espionage as a fictional genre, is this idea that the people in that world are creating their own world among themselves. And Lara, at the heart of your book is actually the story, I don't think this is spoiling anything, is the story of Dr. Zhivago, and how Dr. Zhivago came to be in the world. And so about half the book is told from the point of view of Olya, who was the fictional counterpart of Lara. And I have to ask, is that where your name comes from?
Yes. So I guess for me, my entry point into this espionage story that I wrote was through my name, and being named Lara after Boris Pasternak's heroine. And it was around 2014 that my dad sent me this Washington Post article written by Peter Finn about how the CIA had this role in, smuggling Dr. Zhivago, which was banned in the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain for everyone to read, and creating this big affair over it. And I just thought it was combining all these things in my life that I've grown up loving Dr. Zhivago, and knowing my name came from that, and also my world working in Washington and politics and propaganda, and it was all colliding for me to write this particular book. I didn't ever think, years ago, okay, my first book would have to do with spies, but it just all came together in this really organic way.
So one thing, just to jump in on that, John le Carré once answered the question you posed at the very beginning, Claire, which was, so why do you write spy novels? And his answer was, a spy novel is a spy novel, but it's also a story about love. It's a story about integrity and honor, about international institutions. It's about privilege. And so in some ways, for me, the spy novel provided the guardrails, genre provided the guardrails in which I could then explore all sorts of human characteristics. And I'd be interested to know, Lara, Alma, whether you see your choice of the genre in a similar way.
Yeah, I would say I just write, I think people have assigned genres to my book, maybe the marketers and the business, when I just thought I was writing a novel that was based on an event in history. So I think it just depends on how people categorize my work after that. For me, I'm writing just what I'm interested in, where my heart is and where my passions lie. My next book, although there might be an FBI element, it isn't necessarily in the spy genre. So I hope people who read The Secrets We Kept Still and love the spy genre as I do will like what I write next. But I was just writing a book. I was just writing something I was interested in and found fascinating. And,
Alma is multi-genre.
Yeah, it's every genre. It's history, it's spies, it's a romance.
I mean, for me, I was really happy to be able to write a spy novel after, being in another genre, or really multi-genres, for my first 5 books. But I wanted to do it because, having spent my whole career in it, I really felt there were some things that just about the life that you choose, the people, especially the people that are in it, that don't get well represented in conventional pop culture about spies, whether it's TV or movies or books. And in particular, the women who work in it, that were just not represented in a way that we would, recognize ourselves. And this has led to a lot of interesting discussions when I was out touring and supporting the book, and part of the reason why I think Fox got so interested in it too. And I don't want to turn it into like this big political thing, but usually when we talk about it, I see women shaking their head, whether they're in the intelligence business or in other businesses. It's just, even though you're doing the same job as a man, a lot of times, how you have to approach it, how you have to handle yourself, what your career is going to look like, all of that is just a little different than your male counterparts. And when you couple that with the demands that the intelligence business puts on you in order to have that career, in order to have a top secret security clearance, the sacrifices you have to make in your life, it's really funny because, Claire, you and I live in Washington, everybody, you can't swing a cat without hitting someone, right, who works in the intelligence business. And so it seems like, I just felt like, oh, everyone knows what it takes to keep a security clearance. When I tell people you had to go through a financial disclosure form every year, you have to account for nearly every penny you make. You have to tell them all the foreign nationals you ever meet, including on Facebook. Right. I mean, just those kinds of, that they expect complete candor from you as long as you hold that security clearance. And for me, that's most of my life at this point. And yet you're conditioned to believe they're going to be keeping secrets from you. And that's really what Red Widow is about. It's about what is it like when you give your everything to your agency, to your country, right, to support your countrymen. And then you find out that the agency made a decision that they never told you about that, just destroyed your life. How would you feel and how would you react?
No, that's actually was my next question is, I think all of your books share this idea that you have these characters who really do, despite themselves sometimes, do these things in some sense for love, for something that will never love them back and will in fact betray them. And so talk more about that betrayal and how the betrayal fuels your plots, all of you.
You know, I guess for me, it was inevitable, right? Because it is a part of your career, even if it doesn't happen to you. And I'm not saying it happens to everyone who works in intelligence. And I have plenty of friends who will get out and swear up and down, right? That you know, they have nothing but 100% good recollections of their entire career. But it has hit some of us. So the main, the germ for the story in Red Widow is true. It actually happened. Now I kind of ratcheted up to 11, if you know the Spinal Tap reference, you know, to make it more compelling. But this incredible betrayal that takes place in the heart of the book is a true story. And I'll tell you another thing. If I told you what it was, you'd all recognize it because it was in the news for a long time. It was just never publicly associated with CIA. These things do happen. And you know, it can be devastating to people who really go into it with the best of intentions. You know, I didn't answer one part. The other character, my main character is Lindsay, the younger person, is based on people that I met when I was a recruiter. I spent 1 year as a recruiter for the analytic discipline at CIA. It was actually kind of a punishment assignment because I had pissed off a senior and they shove you out to do a detail for a while. But it was a great, like one of the highlights of my career. And I would meet all these young women at these career fairs at colleges and that sort of thing. And they were astounding. You know, they were brilliant. They were accomplished. They could have been huge successes at anything they wanted to do. But a lot of them wanted to go into intelligence from a very early age and had just applied themselves so much. And, you know, I would take their resumes and talk to them and interview them gratefully. But then I just think, oh my God, you know, I know in a couple years, they're going to break your heart in some way. It's going to break your heart.
Paul, you talk about Moscow rules, which is, and
Right.
it boils down to one, which is trust no one.
Right. Right. So if you were in the Moscow station or the Moscow American Embassy in 1985, it was a denied city. It was a city where Russian surveillance was everywhere. And if you left the embassy, you were always trailed. And so you always knew that something was going on. And and one of the pleasures I had in writing the book is that afterwards, my little confession here is I've never been to Moscow. So I wrote a book that was placed in a city I'd never been to. So I had a little bit of concern about whether or not somebody would read it and say, you know, you got the street name wrong, or, you know, you've got something else wrong. So I happened to connect with a guy named John Berely, who was the first American ambassador to Moscow in the Russian Federation, and was a consular officer in Moscow in 1985 at the time of the book. He read it and he provided some really wonderful edits and gave me a lot of confidence about the book. But his comments validated, you know, my view of what it was like to live in a denied city at the time. And when you live in a world in which you're always under surveillance, you're always, instead of looking over your shoulder, and you're always thinking about what you're saying. And it's sort of that secret world that you carry with you. But if you happen to be somebody who's living a double life, that is, you're pretending to be in the CIA, you're actually working for the KGB, the level at which you have to consider every action and every statement, you know, is much more severe. And in the case of my characters, they had backgrounds in which they had done things that they didn't want to be revealed, and you know, you could call them betrayals, or you could just call them, for them, you know, the secrets they carried. But I think that, as we said in the beginning, that's one of the interesting things about characters who operate as spies. They're living double and triple lives, and they're having to keep the lies and the secrets straight in their own heads. And you know, everybody lies in life, and great fiction, you know, involves lies. All of Shakespeare is about lies. So in some ways, writing about spies is a special permission to go into a world where you can play with lies at, you know, a variety of levels.
And that's, Lara, the secrets they kept. I mean, that works on multiple levels. I don't want to spoil the book for people who haven't read it. So I don't know what you want to talk about some of the other non-CIA secrets that some
I feel like I won't spoil too much. I'll try not to, but as everyone was talking, I think my betrayals that I explore in the secrets we kept fall into a couple of categories. There's some minor betrayals, but I'm really interested in institutional betrayals, and two of which I explore that happen to the same character. One is the betrayal of, being a woman in a boys' club and thinking that you are on the level, you are friends with these people, they are your colleagues, they are your peers, you're on the same level. And what happens when you realize that you are not, and you do not have the same protection, you do not have the same loyalty as they might have for themselves. So that's one thing I'm interested in, that boys club network that was so pervasive in the 50s, but obviously has not ended in Washington. But another, and I guess I'll in terms of, there is a gay relationship in my book between two women, and that's one of the major romances of my book. And the betrayal that is experienced, I won't get into too much, but I was very interested in the history of the lavender scare that began in the 1950s. And everyone probably has read about the Red Scare and what that meant for our country during that same time. But the lavender scare was, an offshoot of the Red Scare, where government agencies were hunting for anyone they considered to be gay or lesbian or different, really. And they would be immediately fired because they were considered to be a liability. And many lives were destroyed. Thousands of lives were destroyed because of it. Sometimes people's names were printed in the newspaper as they were publicly outed and hunted down and stripped of their jobs. And a lot of these firings came from the State Department and intelligence agencies because they considered it a particular liability that these people had their own secret. And so these institutional betrayals is something that I think I will consider. I will definitely be exploring in the future of what does it mean when it's built in with the way these institutions run. What if that is the rule, is, I will betray you because even though you've given your life to this cause, you are not conforming, or you're not what we consider to be worthy of protection.
This leads right into my next question, which I will put to Alma. The bureaucracy that evolves around espionage, it becomes its own animal, and whatever its original goal was, ultimately its objective is its own preservation. So what is interesting to you about that, and how does that play out in your book?
Boy, that's a tough question, because it's, we could go on for hours about it, really. So
I'm gonna ask you this, Paul, too.
So once I left, I had the good fortune to go work for the RAND Corporation for a while as a senior analyst for them. And, they're the assessment people. We get to assess things. So I was able to sort of just informally in my own mind, sort of apply this methodology to the agencies I had worked at. And it's kind of scary. So I won't talk about CIA because honestly, it's not that bad. Like I've worked at other agencies where the bureaucracy has made this culture that really hobbles the organization. And at the same time, they are huge. Like the one that I started at has doubled in size. And we're talking a behemoth organization with a culture that really stifles innovation and that sort of thing. As you mentioned in the beginning, what I do now, and for about the last 12 years, I've been involved in emerging technologies, and I'm a futurist. So work a lot with the agencies on what technologies that are coming that are going to change the business of intelligence, how we do business, not how our targets will look, for instance. And so it's a really scary thing these days. Innovation, technological innovation is very important, not just for the intelligence community. I mean, it's affecting all our lives. So when you have an agency that really resists innovation because it's built into their culture to distrust anything that comes from the outside, if it's not invented here, we won't take it seriously, that sort of thing. It's very scary. The other thing, I'll just throw this out too, is kind of funny. I also advise companies, and a lot of it has to do with companies that want to work with the intelligence business. And it, you know, when you spend your whole life in it, you forget sometimes how specialized these cultures and this business really is. And there is this whole huge mechanism around how you even control seekage, how you control information, knowledge management, all that kind of stuff. That is just, it's almost impossible to grasp if you haven't grown up in it.
Paul, you were the first one to say bureaucracy. So what do you think about this?
It's a very big part of working in government now. And there really isn't, in my view, a whole lot of difference between working where I worked at Time Warner, which was a big company with thousands of employees, and working at the State Department or the CIA. The nature of bureaucracy is that you're a person with a specific job, with a specific remit. You've got a boss who has a boss who has a boss. And there is a mission that the bureaucracy or the company has. In the case of Time Warner, it was to make money, but also to put out products that entertained. In the case of the CIA, the mission is really to collect intelligence that's provided to the White House so that they can make decisions about foreign threats. And in each case, what the bureaucracy does is it sort of subsumes the individual to the mission. And if at the top of the mission, somebody says, you know, we are really angry that the World Trade Center fell, and we have to go find the terrorists, and we will use whatever means necessary to collect the intelligence. And we'll write the legal memos needed to justify our actions. That sort of seeps down into the organization, and the individuals at the bottom who are there to execute have to make personal choices. And it can be very complex depending on what you're intending, what you're doing. It may be that one personal choice is that you disagree, and then the question is, how do you go about asserting yourself with your disagreement? Or you decide that the best thing for your career is to go along, because if you don't, you get sent to HR recruiting or whatever it is you do. And so it's a very complex choice. And this isn't people working in, you know, covert operations overseas. These are people working in headquarters who you know, are, because of the nature of their work, which is not, you know, let's put out a gadget and we'll make money selling the gadget. This is about collecting intelligence and at times putting, you know, people's lives at risks. And that's a very, you know, heavy burden to bear. And I think some individuals bear it well, and then there are other individuals who, you know, as Alma said, you know, decide to go along because that's the spirit, you know, and Dick Cheney has, you know, a lot of power, and he wants to, you know, get every bit of intelligence he can. So those are really complex things. And in my case, I started writing a novel, which was in 1953, in the midst of the Lavender Scare. And my characters were sort of a different early CIA. They were young men, mostly, who had come out of Ivy League colleges, who had studied English, and they were out to sort of make a difference in the world. And at that point, it was a very clear black and white world. You know, the communism was bad and capitalism was good. The Soviets were the enemy, and people like, you know, the senior people in the CIA at the time, really intelligent, you know, soulful individuals who at the time were not really working in a bureaucracy. It hadn't risen to that level. The bureaucracy really sort of emerged by the end of the 50s, when it had just grown so large. And the nature of large organizations, it has to figure out how to organize things. Whereas in the early years with 2, 4, 5, 800 people, you know, it was in a little boys club with a number of typists who had been women in the OSS who had actually done better work than the men, but they ended up being typists.
Yes, which takes us back to Lara.
Right.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
think that's so interesting because I think was drawn to that era as well for that lack of bureaucracy. It was almost the Wild West during the 50s of these idealistic people with extremely progressive views taking on missions like smuggling a book. It's just almost unfathomable today how that would get done. And maybe that is from my background in Washington, where I also worked in campaigns, which is a very different beast than working in a government agency. I think campaigns are kind of flying by the seat of their pants oftentimes, even up to the highest levels. So yeah, it is interesting. I haven't dealt with the bureaucratic novel, but I certainly love to read them because I think it's just fascinating to see what that does to an individual who works in that system.
But you do something that I really liked in your book. There is a narrator who speaks in first person plural. And I think of that narrator as being sort of the institutional voice in some ways. Who in your book is a historical figure other than the Russians?
So other than the Russians, so my book takes place in the East and the West. And in the East, I have Boris Pasternak and Olga Ivanskaya, these real people who existed and were involved in obviously this not the mission, but the writing of the book, Dr. Zhivago. On the Western side, most of my typist characters, those are fictional characters who are based on, amalgamation of real women spies and people who worked as typists in the early days of the CIA and what their lives were like, but they were definitely fictional and their trajectories of what happens to them are fictional.
There's a passing reference to Julia, who went to France with her husband.
Some Easter eggs in my book of real spies. I have Julia Child mentioned as Julia, and Betty McIntosh and Virginia Hall, these heroes of World War II who were working in intelligence in the OSS. So I do like to plant little Easter eggs of the people who I came across during my research and who inspired some of my fictional characters. And of course I have, appearances by Dulles and Frank Wisner and people like that come in. But most of the characters I would say are completely fictional.
So I brought up point of view, and so you all work in very close third person. How do you decide who to put the camera on as you move around within your story? Alma? Because actually, Alma, I saw an early draft of Red Widow,
right,
where really sort of the weight of point of view changed a lot between that early draft and the final version.
Yes, so it's not not really a secret that early on when I conceived of Red Widow, I wanted to use Gone Girl as sort of the model for the book, where you have, several third-person point of view narrators, two of them who are pretty much in opposition, and you have like these big flips, like, at major milestones. The problem was with the spy novel, the advice I was getting was, when the second point of view character comes in, Teresa, the more cynical, beaten up character, the one I identify with, she has a super dynamic voice. I think that when she comes, the book really takes off. And so I wanted that as early as I could in the book, whereas the conventional advice, because once she comes in, there's a huge reveal. And so the conventional advice is to push that as far back into the novel as possible. So there was this constant war back and forth as to when that gets introduced. So I think you saw the earlier version where it was a little bit more traditional and her voice doesn't come in till the end.
Right.
But I'm really glad that we were able to bring that farther forward. So the reveal comes forward a little bit more, and then you get a lot more time for the cat and mouse game between the two women throughout the book.
And with Paul, with Garin, we know from the beginning that Garin is telling different stories to different people, even maybe to himself. So you play a little bit with that. How does the reader know to trust you as the author?
I haven't been asked that question, but it's a good question. Let me just back up a little bit about choice of narrative voice. There was a New Yorker critic who once, I heard him lecture, and he said, the thing about first person is it's very voicey and you can really get into the head of a character. But the thing about third person is that unlike first person, which is sort of one room, a house with one room, with third person, you're in a house with many rooms. And so you can actually explore probably in greater depth or breadth than you can with a single first person point of view. So a lot of spy novels, but not all, are third person, like RA is third person. Graham Greene is often first person. But in my case, I chose really, there's 3 points of view in the book. There is Garen's point of view, then there's Mueller's point of view, and they alternate back and forth. And then there are 1 or 2 moments where Natalia's point of view comes in. But by having alternating point of views, I was able to establish a tension between those 2 men and what they were doing and what they knew about each other. And that tension, I think, was important to moving the plot and the story along. And so I think when you're thinking about the story, conflict between characters is really important. Conflict in a character is important, but between characters is really important. And sometimes alternating points of view allow you to explore that well.
Which they definitely did in Lara's book. How did you decide whose point of view to include and who got to be first person and who was third person?
So
Because everything's in there.
I feel like I was playing with a few things. My first voice that came to me was that first person plural voice of the group of typists, and almost serving as this Greek chorus for the novel, who are popping in as these narrators that think they know everything, but you later find out that some of the secrets they know aren't exactly what was going on. And I think I was having fun playing with that, as you have this first person plural, but then you have a variety of first person accounts, and some of them are informing each other, that some of them are revealing certain things that happened that the other person wouldn't have known. And then I also have a third person. And I think for me, it's all about the voice and finding what I think captures that voice. And I try all different sorts of routes into the story where it starts to flow, and point of view is one of those routes. So when I feel like this sounds like it's not really a exact fact of the matter of how to do this, but I just feel it in my gut that this is the voice for this character. I can hear it in my head. And sometimes that takes all sorts of different trials and entry points and changing of point of view, but I knew it when I knew it. And that's how it is with the novel I'm writing now. I'm like, why am I writing first person all of a sudden for this one person when I had third person the whole time? Like, is this going to work? And I'm like, you know what? Don't worry about it. Just do what you feel is going to be the best story to hear. It's just, what if it unspools out of you, that's where you should go. So I try to see which works and which I feel is the best route.
Alma, you've written other historical novels. Would you think about setting a historical novel in the spy world?
You'd think I should, wouldn't you? I mean, they're very popular. There's still a lot of stories. It's interesting because there's probably some stories that have been declassified that we could mine. Laura, I have to say, I'm sure when you read about this, it came from the Center of the Study of Intelligence's website, and they have the history department. So that's one of the offices I've worked with for 10 years. And I know all the historians there.
Amazing.
One of them was, yeah, it's a small world. What can I say? But those guys are, they know all the stories, right? And they also, of course, know which stories are about to be declassified. So I've tried bribing them. I've tried everything to, get some ideas of what might be a good story. One of them's going to retire, so I'm trying to coax them into, sharing a few secrets with me. I probably should. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
How did you do your research, Paul? You said you talked to one former station chief, but how else did you use this center as well?
Yeah, although I think the best research, my novels are all set in specific locations, specific times. Next one is in Berlin, one in Cuba, one in Moscow, one in Washington, D.C. And I tended to spend a lot of time looking at everything I could at that moment in time in that city, and then tried to get into the heads of characters who were, who lived there. And as I said, biographies, autobiographies are really important, but also the sense of the time. And so sometimes when you go back and look at photographs of a period in Washington in the 50s, for example, you can sort of get a sense of what the city was like. In my case, in The Coldest Warrior, I set it at a particular time, 1975. Ford was in the White House. And Washington, you probably remember, was undergoing a lot of excavation because the underground, the subway was being built. And that event became a big factor in a number of scenes in the novel. So I try to find sort of as Laura said, an historical moment, and try and bring into it enough of the details to give it the sensibility of accuracy. And then into that world place characters. And the key thing is really the characters. The characters have to be authentic. They have to feel like they're in a moment, in a place. Choices they're making are the real choices. But typically I research something for 6 months or 7 months before I actually begin writing anything. And I think that, I know Joe Cannon does, another novelist in this genre, does similar things.
Was that how you do it, Lara?
Yeah, I was just nodding my head because I do have this big backlog that goes into before I even start writing of reading and researching. And it's really enough that you get it all in your head, but I'm not writing a nonfiction book. So I want that background going into it, but I like Paul was saying, the character then has to lead the way, and the inspiration of that character and their life's trajectory has to feel authentic. And so I do, spend many months prior, at least for this book, my first book, reading and researching and finding out everything I can about these people and this event before I start to write. But then I will say, then I'm always writing, and then I come up, I'm like, okay, this is a smaller thing, but I'll get lost in the rabbit hole of like DC department stores and have to go and find out all about, Garfinkel's, like things like that always pop out. So the research is totally continuous up until the very end, where I'm like, what shoes would they wear? And I just get lost and start procrastinating via my research. But the bulk of it, the actual history, the events, that comes first. And it's a little different with my new book because I'm not writing about a historical event. It's completely fictional, but I am writing about it goes back and forth between the past and the present. So there's a bit of that, but not as much as I would say I did with the first book.
You do so much research for your other books. Did you have to do any research for Red Widow, or did you just know it all?
Well, I just knew it. It was such a relief. You guys, Paul and Laura may not know, the last two books, one had to do with the Donner Party and the other one had to do with the sinking of the Titanic. So both were, and this is where people like really hate my guts. I don't spend months doing research. I was a professional researcher for 30 years, so I'm fast. I did as much research as I needed to, and I got to writing, but it was still a lot of research. So writing Red Widow was such a relief because it was just there, like as I'm plotting, I knew what the options were that were going to be available to the characters. You get in the situation, okay, it's this, or this, which way are we going to go? It's so much easier, guys.
I feel that way with the new one. It's just part of what I'm writing is just in me because it's about where I'm from. So I just know a lot of it. I know these people, but it feels like a relief.
Yeah, it does.
I sort of, the novel that I'm writing now, which is not the novel that's coming out in February, it's another one. It puts me in Beirut in 2006, and I've decided my protagonist is a young woman who's in the CIA, and I'm enjoying the idea that I'm putting myself in this world that I can think about vicariously and sort of explore, almost as if I'm reading the book that I'm otherwise writing, and trying to enjoy this sort of discovery of this world And I think as a writer, that's for me, it's one of the great things about being a writer. You can just sort of lose yourself into this imaginary world and meet people you would otherwise never meet, do things you would otherwise never do. And if you do it well enough, other people will enjoy it as well.
So what is the book that's coming in February, Paul?
It's called The Matchmaker. It's set in Berlin in 1989 at the fall of the wall. And CIA, Stasi, it's a sort of a tale of East and West across the wall.
Alma, what are you doing now? What's next for you?
Oh my gosh, it's kind of crazy. So the next book that's coming out is historical horror. It's The Fervor, and it has to do with the Japanese internment, which is very personal to me because I'm Japanese American and all my in-laws were interned. So big part of my life was, hearing about people's experiences. So, and it kind of coincides, has to do a bit with the period of anti-Asian hate that we're experiencing in this country right now. So that comes out in the spring. I'm working on the follow-up to Red Widow. Yeah, I'm really thrilled about that, very lucky. And the TV series. So it is, this is my third career. I'm an executive producer. I have no idea what I'm doing, but it's fascinating. And, really to learn a whole other business. It's funny, we just, when I talk about the spy business and I hear stories of what other people have experienced in, whatever line of work they're in. But we did a pitch to the number 3 guy at the network, and we got to talking somehow about, just all that part. And he looks at me and he goes, TV is the most fucked up business there is, or something like that, which just, really makes me think maybe there's better stories about. Anyway, so that's what's going on for me.
Lara, can you say a little bit more about the book you're working on?
I won't say too much.
Okay.
It's at that early stage, but it's set in Pittsburgh, and I'm from that area. So, and I'm interested in art and family and faith. So that's what I'm exploring now. And that's it. My book has been in development with TV, but we'll see what happens with that. I'm not on the ground involved with all that's going on, but it's exciting, and it does seem like kind of an interesting world to a fiction writer to explore.
I mean, your book it's like Mad Men, except women in the CIA. It would be awesome. Paul, do you have anything in development in other media?
No, the book is out to a couple of film agents from my literary agent, but I think Alma, you're very lucky because the number of books that actually are optioned is low, and the number of books optioned that actually make it to the screen is an infinitesimally small number. So, but on the other hand,
I was going to say, I'm waiting for the plug to get pulled any day. I mean,
but on the other hand, right now there's an insatiable appetite for content because Netflix and Apple and Amazon are just sort of absorbing as much as they can, and so it's a good time to have novels or stories that can lend themselves to the screen. I would say that there aren't that many that have actually gone off and become good books that have become good series. There are a few, but not that many. I don't know if you had watched Berlin Station, which was based on Olin Steinhauer stuff. And that was actually quite good.
Yeah.
And I think Olin is based in Washington, D.C., or lives there, or did for some period of time.
I'm sorry, who is this? You said
Olin Steinhauer?
Olin Steinhauer.
I'd love to meet him. Can you arrange that?
No.
All right, we are running out of time, and this has been so much fun, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time and being here with us. One last question. If someone came to you and said, well, I've never read a spy novel, what should I read? If you're not recommending your own book, which of course you would and should, what book do you recommend? Lara?
Transcription by Kate Atkinson.
Excellent. Paul?
The Spy Who Came In from the Cold by John le Carre.
Classic. Alma?
Almost any Le Carre. I'm a huge Le Carre fan. I really love The Night Manager, though, actually.
That was my second pick.
And that was actually a really good TV adaptation.
Right, that made a big
Those
TV
people are
show.
developing mine. The Le Carre's sons are developing mine into the television show.
Oh,
So
that's
the
wonderful.
Night Manager people.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so they know what I think they know what they're doing, I hope.
Let's hope. So the books are Lara Prescott, The Secrets They Kept. Paul's is The Mercenary. Alma's is Red Widow. They are all available from your favorite bookseller, and you should read them all. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to throw it back to our hosts right now.